Hello. Um, Welcome to the Institute for Humanities presentation of Dr. Dhanashree Thorat, who is going to be talking to us today about what is the digital humanities anyway. Dr. Dhanashree Thorat is an assistant professor in the Department of English here at Mississippi State. Dhanashree, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you
I'll,
so much for having me.
I'll just remind everyone who is tuning in, thank you very much for joining us. And if you have any questions for Dr. Thorat as she's giving her presentation, please just put the question below the presentation in that kind of feed area, like a comment, and we'll be sure to get to those at the end. So without any further ado, Dr. Thorat, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for having me here. And thank you, John, for all your help getting everything set up. Let me try and share my screen so we can see if the first step of the digital humanities will get us somewhere. So give me a moment while I do this. And Julia, please tell me if you see the screen.
Yes, I'm starting something. Yes, I see. It looks like a PowerPoint a little bit.
Yes.
All
I'm
right,
just going to
great.
keep my PowerPoint in the browser so it's easier to switch windows. And what I'm going to do for you today is give you some examples of what DH projects look like, some introduction to the field, and then end with some pointers on where you can learn more about the field if you are interested. I have to say before I start that it's really exciting to be here. I'm still a relatively new person to Mississippi State. And the last talk I did on campus was actually my job talk.
Oh, wow.
So this is a little bit more informal and a little bit less stressful. So I do
I should
like
hope
it.
so.
So let me share what I have with you. And Julia, if I cut out at any point, please just get my attention in some way and tell me to stop.
Okay.
To get started with this, let me just give you a brief introduction to where the field has come from. This term digital humanities came about in the early 2000s, and the very first publication is widely considered to be this companion to DH, which was published in 2005. Before this, the term that was being used to define this kind of field, this set of inquiries, was called humanities computing. And then
Mm.
there was a lot of discussion about whether the term computing in there would turn off humanities scholars, whether it placed too much emphasis on computing technologies, digital technologies, and how do you really center humanistic inquiry in this field. And so digital humanities kind of became the more popular term. And I think it was really that 2009 MLA conference where people were tweeting a lot, talking about DH. There were a number of panels, and there was basically a critical mass of people. And that's where this field really kind of took off. In terms of where the field comes from, there's a lot of different kinds of origin stories. So one story traces DH back to Roberto Busa's work from 1950 to 1970. He worked for 30 years to basically produce this corpus of Aquinas's work, and he worked with IBM. And that kind of puts DH or traces DH to a particular line of work in computational text analysis. Some of the DH organizations today, I think it's the ACH, which still has an award named after his work. But in the last several years, there have kind of been these counter narratives, counter origin stories of where the field comes from. And one of these narratives, for example, evokes Black work or Black journalism and Black sociologists, Black people who were Black scholars who worked with data to basically challenge systemic racism. So
Mm.
folks like Ida B. Wells and her Red Record, she was a journalist and she produced this tabulated account of lynchings in the United States. It was a very early account at a data project, what we would today consider perhaps a data project. And so scholars like Ruha Benjamin and Kim Gallen consider her to be a data scientist in a way that we don't commonly think about data scientists today. I think when we think of data, we think big data, right? Millions of tweets. But there are other ways of imagining data as well. And then Du Bois had a very interesting series of visualizations. Obviously, he was a very early founding person in sociology, and these visualizations were again supposed to illuminate something about systemic racism in America. And these are kind of different stories which have come up, different narratives and histories which people have articulated to show that you don't have to trace DH to one kind of movement. There are different origins possible, and they do different kinds of work for people. So, for example, in India, obviously there might be a different story altogether. And for different global south locations, there might be different origin stories. And there has been a lot of interest in kind of globalizing digital humanities in the last several years. So this is the origin of the field, and I have to say, to get to a definition is to ask a very contested question. I think there have been entire books about, how do we define the field? There is actually a very interesting DH project where different definitions are loaded every time you refresh the page. It's called What is DH? And every time you click refresh, it will give you a new definition because there's so many out there. So this is the definition that I would like to give you all. This is from Kathleen Fitzpatrick. And she says that DH is a nexus of fields. So again, that interdisciplinary nature is emphasized at the very beginning, in which scholars use computing technologies to investigate the kinds of questions that are traditional to the humanities. And what you will notice here is that humanistic inquiry is very much centered in DH. DH is not placed in opposition to the humanities. It is not trying to take over the humanities. The humanities are very much central. And I say this because there are concerns about DH. Sometimes I think because DH has certain lines of funding attached to it, there are these fears that everything is going to become DH in the future. And I don't think that will be the case. The humanities is a very broad array of inquiries, and DH certainly centers humanistic inquiry. But when Kathleen Fitzpatrick says use computing technologies, what she means is to use digital methods. And DH offers some very interesting methods to do the work that we have already been doing. For example, I've listed one example here, which is using computational text analysis, for example, to study 1,000,000 tweets. And obviously, the advantage here is that it's hard to read 1,000,000 tweets, or it's hard to read 1,000,000 books. So how can we use digital technologies, digital methods to help us do our work? And that is the first kind of intervention that DH makes. It gives us different methods, and I'll show you some of these methods later. And then the other aspect of DH, according to Fitzpatrick, is that you can ask traditional kinds of humanistic questions about computing technology. So essentially giving us new areas of study, new sites of research where we can pursue the work we want to do. And one example of this, for example, is how is gender reproduced in Facebook's computational systems, its infrastructure. There is actually very interesting research on this about how gender was coded in zeros and ones, with male and female, and 0 and 1 were the values that were assigned to them. So kind of going back to these ideas of binary gender encoded within the system. And of course, there's other kinds of questions possible, but essentially giving us these new kinds of digital spaces, digital culture that we can study through our lens. And this is a fairly solid definition. As I said, if you Google this, you will find a lot of other kinds of definitions here, and I do encourage folks to look at them as well if you want to kind of dive into these further. So broadly speaking, right, this is what DH does for us. It, as humanities scholars, it gives us new methodologies, new digital praxis to do our work. And I do include pedagogy as one of these practices. It gives us new sites of research, and it also gives us new forms of sharing our scholarship. And the examples that I pull from are going to emphasize that particularly, because I think this is one of the really exciting parts about doing DA, that there are new ways of sharing our scholarship beyond journal articles, the monograph, and these kinds of traditional print publications. And then there has been this kind of emphasis on activist scholarship, on scholarship in action, scholarship which intervenes in political public life in some way. And I am very excited about that kind of possibility as well. So I'll share some examples. So, what I thought I might do at this point, since I've been talking kind of broadly, I thought I might give you a more specific example. And I'm going to take for my example the lens of space and place as an approach, as an area, as something that spatiality is something that has been of interest to many disciplines within the humanities, right? Whether we are in English or history or philosophy, geography, we all kind of share some interest in spatiality, in how space is constructed, in how spaces are gendered and racialized. So I'm going to take this one optic, so to say, and I'm going to give you examples that illustrate these points. And I will say at the outset that space and place is just one optic, right? So you can do different kinds of work with DH, but I'm going to use that to kind of go a little bit deeper and point out what DH work does. So let me take my first example, and this is with digital methods. So as I mentioned, one of the really exciting things that DH does for humanities scholars is that it gives us these new methodologies for pursuing the kinds of research questions we've always been interested in pursuing. And this is certainly the case with mapping. Mapping is a form of data visualization. There's other possibilities for it. I'm going to focus on mapping for these examples. And the first example I have for you is this project called Native Land CA. And as you can see, as soon as you land on this page, it does something which is really not possible with a traditional print publication. There is really no way to print this and to have it do the same thing. And essentially, what this project is visualizing is the various indigenous nations in America. And of course, I'm defining America very broadly, as you can see. It's the Americas, really. And there's not a lot in the South, but it has a very detailed map of the various nations in North America. And it's the digital tool here is doing something unique, right? You have these overlapping areas that you can see when you zoom in on them. You can actually search for your particular area. So if I put in Starkville, Mississippi, you can zoom in on Starkville and it will tell you what tribal land, what indigenous land we are living on at the moment. So these are kind of different possibilities with a digital tool that you could not have in a print publication. And this other project is doing something similar with mapping. This is Slave Revolt in Jamaica. This is a history project, and what they have produced essentially is an interactive map that plays through this revolt in Jamaica. So every time you click somewhere, it's going to visualize the movement of people, of of the rebellion, of the troops, and you can click on individual areas and it's going to tell you what happened there or on the side. So it's a very kind of interactive way of engaging with this scholarship. And again, you see that it's doing something which is not really possible with a print-based publication, right? This kind of movement that it allows you to visualize is very unique. So to bring you back to where I'm going with this is what I want to illustrate for you through these projects. The first thing is that these digital projects are a form of scholarship, right? This is not just visualizing something for fun, although that is possible, or it's not just remediating old information, but this is very much about creating new knowledge, right? And for example, what the Slave Revolt project says in their About page is that mapping the Great Jamaican Insurrection allows us to see how the island's topography shaped the course of the revolt. So this is taking up the space of the map, taking up this digital method to actually illuminate something new about this slave revolt in Jamaica. It's not just about, regurgitating old scholarship, but very much about generating new insights. And MLA and the AHA, there are different organizations that have actually started crafting guides for evaluating digital scholarship, particularly for tenure. So there have been these conversations about how to count this as scholarship. The second thing, of course, is that these projects use digital technology in a very interesting and innovative way. They're doing something that cannot be done in print. And this is very central to DH, right? That you're using digital technology in a critical way to advance your work. So, for example, if I just typed my essay in Word, that's not exactly DH, right? Because I'm not doing anything innovative. I'm just typing in Word. So you have to do something innovative with that technology, whatever digital method you have. The other thing I want to emphasize here is that this is a very collaborative and interdisciplinary endeavor. Now, those of you who are, I imagine most of you who are attending are humanities scholars, you're probably looking at this and saying, how did they build this? How can I build it, right? I do not have coding skills. I do not have the technical skills to do this. And the answer to that is it's okay, right? You do not have to be a programmer or a coder to do DH. What you need instead is a team. Most of these projects, if you go to their about pages and you look at the teams that have built them, these are fairly big teams, probably pulling on folks in the humanities, in IT, in the archives, in the libraries. You might have a project manager. And that's really one of the different things about DH as a field, that it encourages collaborative work. Humanities research is so often about us, sitting down at a table in a room by ourselves and we do our own work. And DH kind of pushes back against that model. And it has to be interdisciplinary, right? Because one person just cannot do all of this work to produce a major project like this. And then, of course, the really exciting part about this is that it is open access scholarship, which means it is accessible to broader audiences. And this is really critical, as you might imagine, with this project on Jamaica. This would actually be accessible to people in Jamaica, right? So it's not just keeping knowledge within the boundaries of the global north or within the university or within databases which are not accessible to anybody, but it's really opening up the knowledge and the resource to broader audiences. And that has been a really important push indeed for open access publishing. But there is more, right? There's more here. The other thing that I said DH does for us is it opens up new sites of research. And these new sites could, really be anything, right? You have social media, digital culture, digital spaces, Instagram. People are studying Instagram, TikToks, right? And TikToks has a very kind of new genre of study or a new genre of expression. There is e-literature. So all of these new kind, oh, my cat has just joined us. Ignore the cat. She wants to do the presentation with me. But these new sites, and one of the examples that I had for you is from a digital game. This might be familiar. This is the Oregon Trail.
I
You may have
played that as a kid. I was looking at the screen. I'm like, I haven't seen that since I was in 4th grade.
It's
Wonderful.
actually, you can play it online on the Internet Archive. So the Internet Archive, this link that I've included here, they have basically uploaded a lot of these 80s and 90s games that some of us may have played, and you can actually play it on your browser now. So Julia, check it out and play it. But again, you can see there's questions about space and land, right, that we can take up in the context of this game. We can look at settler colonialism in the context of this game, how participants or how game players become complicit in a colonial project, how this game renders the Midwest as open land for the taking, how this constructs American land. And all of these are kind of questions related to space and land and ecology that we can take up in the context of this one game. And of course, I do want to emphasize this critical point that DH is not something which came out of nowhere, right? So DH scholarship does draw on earlier scholarship in science and technology studies, in media studies. There are a lot of connections between DH, the theories and ideas which have emerged in DH, and some of these other fields which work alongside DH. Many of the early DH scholars worked in media studies, for example. So I don't want to emphasize this, as a field that has broken away from existing or external scholarship. And then, of course, when you do research on this kind of project, if you're studying a digital game or Instagram, your scholarship can take different forms. So you can either produce a digital project like the ones that I showed you earlier, or you can still have a traditional scholarly publication. And I do want to emphasize that for those of you who are listening to my talk, that DH does not mean that you only produce digital projects. That traditional publications are very much part of DH inquiry. And personally, for my own research, that is what I do. I actually study digital infrastructure, and I am producing journal articles and a monograph. So it doesn't mean that you have to kind of leave those behind. Of course, there are questions about tenure. There are questions about for graduate students in terms of the job market, in terms of what kind of scholarship do you produce, which will be taken as serious scholarship. And as we know, the traditional publications sometimes do count more than digital publications, than open access publications. So I do encourage, if we have graduate students with us, to kind of think very carefully about these concerns as you move forward. But again, what DH gives us here is these different sites of study. Right? You can look to other forms, you can see what's going on in cyberspace, in digital space, in digital culture. And then the last idea that I wanted to emphasize for you here is this idea of scholarship in action, or activist-based scholarship. And this has been a very kind of interesting new development. It comes out of the Transform DH movement in DH. And Transform DH happened, I think, in the late 2000s, when the field was really looking inwards to consider its own biases, its own limitations. And what people were noticing is that the big DH conference kind of had issues with gender, with race. I think there was research that showed if you submitted under a gender studies tag for the conference, your paper was less likely to be accepted. So the field has had these kinds of issues. Some parts of the field are very much oriented around white voices. They reify the white canon. This has been true with digital archives, for instance. And so there was this kind of movement for us to be more attentive about these issues and address these erasures. And what has come out of that, much in more contemporary times, I think, is this kind of project, which is very much politically situated and takes up this charge, this call to action to intervene in crisis. And I do want to show you this torn apart project because it's such an exciting project. You can search for this. It's torn apart or separados. And this was basically created in one summer. It was a rapid action project responding to ICE detentions, which happened, I think, in 2019. When did ICE detentions happen? There has been so much happening politically in this country. It's hard to keep track of what went wrong when, but I think it was 2018. Was it 2 years ago or 3 years ago? But essentially, what this project does is it visualizes this geography of ICE detentions. There are different kinds of visualizations. This one is looking at how much ICE money is received by different congressional districts. And it will give you some really impressive numbers, right? Which basically shows you that there is money to be made out of hosting these ICE detention centers. And there's different visualizations that they've produced as part of this. Some of these are a little bit harder to figure out. And DH does have, some of the scholarship is more accessible, and some of it you have to kind of look at and be like, okay, what am I looking at here? You have to spend a little time with it. But this was this very exciting project. It launched very quickly, and they put out 2 volumes of it. And it was essentially intended to raise public awareness about something which was in the news at the moment. And the question here is, the humanities has so much to offer, but the humanities is always in crisis, right? We're always having to justify our funding situation. And this is a project that kind of shows you that actually the humanities is very needed. We are a part of contemporary current political conversations, and we do have a role to play in the university and in public life. So this was one of the examples. But the other example that I will point out here was the COVID Black Initiative, which launched this past summer as a response to what we were seeing in the national inequities with who COVID was affecting, right? The community differences, that it was affecting Black communities more than other communities. So there have been these rapid action projects which come out a lot faster than a traditional journal article would, for example. And the emphasis there is on public awareness, sparking conversations, and raising awareness about an issue. And I will say that all of this is possible in the context of digital pedagogy. So I've talked mainly about research, but you can also think about how students can be involved with this, because one of the nice things about DH is that it tries to de-emphasize traditional academic hierarchies. It tries to encourage people from different parts of their career, at different levels of their career, to work together. And so there is a lot of student involvement with digital projects. Of course, you kind of have to talk about ethics when it comes to student involvement, but there is a lot of interest in students being a part of these major projects. This project on the left is actually Plaques of Presidency. One of my colleagues in India just launched this 2 months ago, and this is a story map that his class produced in, I think, one semester, where they are looking at the different memorials on their campus and they wrote stories about them and they are mapped on the page. I'll leave this for you to look at later. And then this actually is an example from one of my classes, Bulldog Campus. As you can see, familiar names now. And my students essentially built this project to tell stories about our campus buildings. So they did research about the buildings, they went to the archives, they looked at journal articles, news articles, and they went and talked to people in the buildings, and then they wrote stories about their chosen building. And they had some interesting things to share. They were all freshmen, they were new to campus. So it was a way for them to engage with our local community, so to say. And they found really interesting things. Apparently, we have haunted buildings. So if you're interested, you can go check that out and see what they found. There was a building that's associated with like chicken sacrifices. I don't know. I learned new things from my students as well. But again, emphasis on place, right? But different things we can do with digital platforms. And it is possible to do this with students as well. I do want to kind of emphasize that. So as I said, the possibilities with this are quite vast, right? I've emphasized only one method for you, which is digital mapping, but these are some of the other possibilities for digital methods. You can take up text analysis, network analysis, and then of course you have different sites of study, different approaches, and also you have different topics which are raised up in DH scholarship. So there have been conversations about ethics, about multilingualism in digital spaces. These are all kinds of current conversations in the field. So there's a lot to do here. Space is not just one, it's just one of them, right? Mapping is just one of these options. So what I want to do as I wrap up is to just point out some resources very quickly, and then I will take questions. So let me finish this. So those of you who are interested, I would recommend actually starting with the DH conference. This is the 2018 conference. They just had the 2020 conference online because of COVID, but this is a good place to go and see kind of the current trends in the field. What are people talking about right now? And then ADHO and ACH and GoDH, all of these organizations are very active online. They have listservs. You can get involved with different initiatives there. For those of you who want to read some current scholarship, I would recommend DHQ, which is Digital Humanities Quarterly. This is really the most active DH journal at the moment. And then Debates in Digital Humanities is one of the two book series that publishes in DH. The other book series is out of Illinois. I've highlighted Debates in DH because this is open access. You can actually read every book in this series online. And they have really important, kind of groundbreaking essays that have defined DH scholarship. And if you just want to keep up with opportunities in DH, Digital Humanities Now is a kind of aggregator. They just collect different jobs, grants, and they have a Twitter account. And I do recommend joining Twitter for anybody who is interested in DH. Twitter is the way to learn about DH. I firmly believe that. If you want to attend a training session, I've talked about mapping, but some of you might be like, how do I get into mapping? I don't know how to do digital mapping. And if you want to attend one of these training sessions, you have a week-long, basically, workshop to learn about this. And if you want to do some research on your own, you can go to Tapor. They list tools. You can look through the different tools, find what you want, and kind of play around with it on your own. Now, one thing I do want to emphasize, which is actually a very current opportunity, is this Haystack Scholars Program. They have applications due at the end of this month. And this is open to graduates and undergraduate students. So if any of you are students here, or if you are faculty working with students, please encourage them to apply. It's a very exciting program that lets you kind of be in community with other DH scholars. And Haystack does a lot. It's basically like a social network. It's like a Facebook for DH scholars. And if anybody has questions about that, I'm happy to take questions. And I will end with this. I do want to give a shout out to one of our really exciting DH projects at Mississippi State. This is a shaky truth. It does come out of history. So, Julia, shout out to your department and Judy Ridner. And of course, we have a lot of kind of different conversations and groups on campus, which may not be directly related to DH, but which pursue work related to DH. So I do recommend taking a look at these. And I think in interested faculty, you have folks like Scott DiGiulio in classics, Joe Thompson in history. So we do have folks around campus. We just don't, I think, have like a consolidated group. If anybody is interested in consolidating a DH working group or something of that sort, I'm definitely down for that. So I will stop here. Thank you so much, Julia, for having me. And please ask me questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dhanashree. That was fantastic. I have worked around digital humanities projects before and never really quite understood what was going on. So your definitions and your examples were really helpful. And we are already getting questions in. I'll just remind our viewers, oh, and I'm going to clap. I'm sure everyone is going to be clapping. The clapping part of presentations is always awkward because you can't get that lovely sound that we crave. I should get a clapping sound buzzer or something.
I know.
Or snaps. But thank you very much. We do have questions already coming in, but I'll just remind those of you who have been listening to and watching and enjoying the presentation that if you have a question for Dr. Thorat, please just write it in the comments underneath where you're seeing this presentation, and I'll be sure to ask it on your behalf. So I'm just going to jump in with my questions if I can. I'm just going to take the privilege of being the moderator here. And I just kind of wanted to ask, how much digital humanities is open access? Because I know open access is a word that's often associated with digital humanities. And it makes me kind of wonder, like, does this mean that much of our research will be available for free? Is this going to affect how publishing happens or peer review, or digital projects peer reviewed if they're open access? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so this is a big emphasis in DH, and I do think it's one of the key differences between traditional humanities fields and DH. Because the idea here is that what we produce it should be approachable, it should be accessible, and we should be able to have broader public audiences engage with our work. I do think a lot of DH projects are open access. There are some exceptions to that, and there are projects which are actually tied to databases that are subscription based. But there has always been this kind of pushback against that model, particularly because I think one of the things people found was that the subscription based projects often involved Black digital humanities, and it kind of placed a barrier to accessing this very important area in DH. And what happens if scholarship about race and Blackness in America or in more transnational contexts is again placed behind these barriers which hinder people from accessing them. So there has been a pushback against that model. And DHQ, which is the big DH journal, is open access. The publishing series is also open access. And I think Illinois has been trying to make some of their DH books open access as well. So I do think that has been the focus of some of these new initiatives. There's also been models for open peer review. So ADA, which is a journal in new media and gender studies, was actually doing an open peer review for their issues, where the community could give feedback on articles before they moved forward. So there has kind of been this push to also develop an infrastructure around open access publishing. So that includes, the peer review, the platform itself. So you have to have, a very accessible, readable platform if you're going to have open access publishing. And this is where, the libraries have been very critical. I think the libraries have really pushed this conversation. Archivists have really pushed this conversation on open access as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we've got a couple of questions coming in, so I'll jump in so that we have time for all of them. The first question that I see is from Avery Ferguson, who asks, "What digital humanities methods and/or tools do you find yourself using the most in your research regarding literary studies?"
Okay. So I have to say, I'm actually a literature person who does not write very much about literature. At the moment, I will make that concession. My current book project is actually on infrastructure. I'm literally looking at like cables and pipes in the Atlantic. That is my research
Wow.
at the moment. But I will say I teach literature and I love teaching literature, and I do DH projects in my literature classes. Mapping has honestly been a very exciting method for teaching novels in particular. So, 2 semesters ago, I taught Edwidge Danticat, and my students had actually pulled out all the place names from her novel. And we made a Google map to map all of those place names to take a look at basically mobility and migration so that we could kind of ask these questions about how Haitian migrants are able to move, where they live, where they settle, where Haitian communities in the United States are formed. So mapping has been interesting. Archiving is the other one. So when I was a postdoc at KU, my class read a book by Mohsin Hamid, and they actually created a digital exhibit to talk about different keywords related to his novel. We read Exit West. And so some of them talked about surrealism and post colonialism. And they basically made a website where they wrote mini essays, so to say, about these different terms, which would let somebody engage with that novel in a more nuanced way. The other one that I will recommend is Wikipedia entries.
Really?
I highly recommend this as an assignment for literature majors because Wikipedia is something which is open access. They're always looking for people to edit their entries. That's how they develop entries. And if you are working or if you're teaching a novel or you're teaching an author who is not, who falls outside the canon, right? So to say,
Right.
they most likely do not have a good Wikipedia entry. So I've had students write abstracts or write themes about the novel or write biographies, write about critical reception. And one time we essentially built a whole page about the novel we were reading. So it's a very interesting assignment. I think it's probably something that gets the most eyes, right? So I think for the students, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm actually doing something that a lot of people are going to read.
Wow.
And it changes the way they think about their work in the humanities classroom. I think they're more attentive to what they are writing, to how they are saying things. We talk about plagiarism because Wikipedia will flag plagiarism like this. They are very fast about it. So you can have like all the conversations we would have about sources and ethics and writing style and tone and audience, but in this different kind of context. So,
That's
so, so
fascinating.
I would say to just repeat what I said: mapping, digital exhibits, and Wikipedia. Those are kind of my 3 go-to things in the literature classroom.
Right. And that brings more attention to some of those works that aren't necessarily in the canon. So fantastic.
Exactly.
Wow. Well, questions are pouring in, so I'll go on to the next one. The second question is from Kay Bricado. She says, "This digital humanities field seems to bring qualitative research into respectable realms of the quantitative world. Do you find this to be so?"
I'm not sure I entirely follow the question. Could you repeat what the first part of it? It brings the qualitative.
Yes, it says the digital humanities field seems to bring qualitative research into respectable realms of the quantitative world. Do you find this to be so? The question seems to imply that in a world, in a more scientific world where things are very much based on what you can measure with very specific metrics, that there might not be a lot of interest in more qualitative questions. So does digital humanities help this kind of more metric-based science entertain more qualitative questions, more humanities-based questions?
Definitely. And I think this has always been a source of tension, right? Particularly with areas like big data, which is the emphasis in many fields at the moment. And, what do you get out of big data research? What is big data? What do you get out of small data? What if you don't have a million tweets? What if you only have like 1,000 tweets? It is still a big number, in its own
Yeah.
way. So I do think there has been this kind of attention to what is possible with qualitative research. And just because we are pulling on digital methods and we can crunch big numbers, it doesn't mean that we are not attentive to qualitative research. I will say one of the kind of pushbacks, in fact, against quantitative research has been in the realm of data ethics and data justice. So, 2 years ago, Jessica Marie Johnson published this really germinal article on digital Black studies. And she talks about Black data, the fact that data in our archives is not apolitical, right? I think she terms this as data is the evidence of terror, because this is all data which is collected about enslaved people in ledgers and ship manifests and so on. And so if we talk about big data, if we are kind of aggregating and pulling all of this data together, are we actually attending enough to where that data comes from, to how it is collected, who collected it, how it's going to be used? And of course, this is very timely because of datafication. We know that Facebook is collecting our data. We're on Facebook Live. They probably have all our information at this point. So all of this data is being collected, right? So there are these possibilities for quantitative work, but I think that issue of ethics and what we do with that data are still very much in the realm of the humanities. But yes, definitely there is this emphasis on mixed methods, right? DH does open up these possibilities for working with big data, but that does not mean that qualitative research is de-emphasized. That's definitely not the case.
Right. And that was one of the things that I was really excited about when I was listening to your talk a few minutes ago was this wonderful marriage of what we think of as more traditional humanities and what we think of as something more scientific based or more numbers based or math based or metric based. Because, humanities and the sciences are not in two distinct worlds that have nothing to do with each other. They clearly are melding all the time. And digital humanities seems to really bring that out. So I have another question that's come in from Dan Punday. I think you know who he is.
Yes.
Yes, I think you know that name. He asks, do you have any advice on helping to build a culture of digital humanities here at MSU? Best to start with supporting faculty, student projects? Do we start with infrastructure? What do you think?
So I will speak from my experience at UF, where I was a grad student, and this was when UF was starting to we had people in different departments who were interested in DH in the same way that I think we have at the moment at Mississippi State, but there wasn't that kind of consolidation, or there wasn't an infrastructure quite in place. And I think what helped at UF, there was a working group which got going, which kind of started bringing people together. And the DH working group eventually started doing a yearly DH event. They did, it's called the Dat Camp. It's like an unconference. That's literally what it's called. So it's not as formal as a conference, but basically to bring people together for conversations and to enable networking to happen. Because what you need for DH projects to get off the ground is collaboration. For example, right now I don't really have any project partners in the computer sciences, for example, right? And that department would be a very interesting department to go to and to talk about some of these issues, right? How can their students be involved with our work? How can we be involved with their work? Because most likely they are doing work on data in some way, right? These conversations that I've just talked about. And so we have to have a way, I think, for people to start networking and collaborating. And I think building the technical infrastructure is maybe even second to building the scholarly infrastructure first, and to have these conversations with people and letting people determine what kinds of projects they want to take up. And I say that because DH has so many different possibilities, and it's really hard to decide what kind of infrastructure you want to invest in. I know, for example, that the libraries here has been working on an Omeka subscription. So we now have access to Omeka as a platform to build digital archives and digital exhibits, and that's one possibility. But there's so many other options for DH projects that it's really hard even for established centers to say we're going to invest in all of these or even invest in some of them. So I do think, based on what I see right now and my own needs at the moment, if I may be selfish here, Dad,
Yeah.
it's about how do we get that collaboration started? How do we get people from different disciplines talking to each other and having these conversations across our disciplinary silos? I think that is really crucial. If there was a possibility for a grant funding initiative on campus for DH initiatives, I think that might also be really interesting. There have been models for small grants, for mini grants, basically, where faculty, for example, are given grants to integrate a DH component in their syllabus, or a grant for a student to take up a mini project. And sometimes the smaller grants, obviously, are not enough to do big projects, but they are enough to kind of get people started, to get people interested, and maybe work towards a bigger grant funding. And that model actually worked at KU, where I was a postdoc in a research center, and that center offered small grants for faculty and also for projects. So the funding issue.
Funding, Dan. Maybe a department chair with a lot of clout could start getting some of those things started. I'll go ahead. Thank you, Dan, for that question, and thank you, Dhanashree, for that answer. It is very exciting, the possibility of having more digital humanities on campus. And I'll just also mention that there is some interdisciplinary work going on with the Interdisciplinary Forum, which, if I can be selfish, as an Institute for the Humanities program, we are having rolling submissions right now. If anyone would like to present something, a work in progress, an idea of how to bring more digital humanities to campus, maybe this semester. So more information is on. From Sol Perez, and she asks, in traditional archival work, you are able to have surprises, find something that you are not looking for. Do you think that with the digital archives that is possible, considering that it seems that the archives depend on what some sites might upload? So, that maybe if a digital archive site doesn't upload everything, just specific things depending on its project, it doesn't allow the researcher to have those surprise moments.
So I'll say two things. One, I think the question of erasure is always relevant, whether it is in an archive that you're walking into, or it is a digital archive. And I think you always have to kind of ask yourself about, what's missing in the digital archive, what material could not be digitized. Because if you ask any archivist, a lot of archives nowadays do have digital parts to them. For example, our own library has digitized material. But if you ask any archivist about what material is not digitized, they're going to say, a big chunk of it is not. And so, really, what you're seeing online is probably a very small component of the overall archives which are in holding at that institution. So I think that issue of erasure and absence and what's missing in the digital archive is very much important. And the other issue that has come up with that with DH is, what gets funding to be
Right.
digitized. So there was this issue, or there were these concerns early on in the field that essentially DH was reproducing white canonical knowledge. For example, there was funding to digitize Mark Twain and Emily Dickinson, and essentially white scholars, white writers who were very much canonical in English studies. But you did not have a similar kind of push to say digitize papers by Morrison or by Black writers or Latinx or Asian American writers. So erasures are very much, a part of this conversation. But I do think that element of discovery and surprise is possible in a digital archive nonetheless. And I say this because I was just actually Googling in our Indian archives. I was searching within their interface for material related to telegraphs. And the things I found in that search, right, were things that I just did not expect. So I think you don't have the same connection to materiality, right? I think you're not visiting the archive and you're not pulling things out and opening
Right.
them and maybe sneezing
Hmm.
with the dust. So that is missing, but I do think the archive will still throw up its surprises for you. I think for those of us who are used to visiting the archives, that missing element of touching and holding the material,
Yeah.
it's definitely there, right? I will acknowledge that for sure. But you will be surprised with digital archives as well, just because you just don't know what you might find, and the way things get tagged, the way things get categorized. There are different ways of organizing within digital archives that I think can help kind of illuminate connections between material, between archival material, or show you something new that you did not expect. So I
Right.
would say, one of the interesting things about digital archives is actually those kinds, the computational choices which are made in presenting that interface, right? How is the search algorithm working? How do tags work in the digital archive? How does metadata work in a digital
Hmm.
archive? I think though that's where you might see something unexpected.
Right. And people are still doing a lot of that work, a lot of the kind of categorizing or tagging or creating the metadata or figuring out where and how to put information is still something that people are doing, even if they're using digital tools and putting it out there on a digital
Definitely,
format. Right.
definitely. In fact, I think one of the really interesting projects, the Black Book Interactive Project, has been doing very important work on metadata. Because one of the conversations that has been happening in that context is, how is tagging itself reflective of, say, normative ideas, and how do we
Right.
create tagging metadata structures which are more equitable, which reflect people's lived realities. And so they have been working with this corpus of Black literature, and they have created a metadata schema which is very much attentive to what's going on in this corpus of Black literature. So it's not trying to
Hmm.
be apolitical or neutral, but even having tags for something like racism or music or different aspects of Black life within that corpus, which will let people engage with that corpus and discover different things in that corpus. So there's been very interesting things happening both with tagging in Black archives, but also in Indigenous archives. That's the other space where I think there have been some very interesting metadata schemas.
Interesting. Well, we are at time. We were at 5 o'clock. So, I mean, I know time flies, doesn't it? Dr. Thorat, thank you so much for your time and for explaining digital humanities to us today. We have recorded this presentation and we will be putting it on the Institute for Humanities website. So if anyone wants to take a peek and think, how can we build digital humanities more at Mississippi State? This might be a good place to start. And again, Dr. Thorat, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us this evening. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone out there on Facebook at our next Institute for the Humanities presentations on what are the humanities. So thank you very much.
Thank you.